All right, welcome to building out your low poly character. Um, we're going to specifically concentrate on doing low poly hair and props, sort of addendums to the character. This is your basic laid out face. So the character has a range of expressions with eye holes and with a mouth hole. And I've done a very rudimentary mouth bag here with extrusions, kind of clunky. I'm sure people can spend more time on it and do a better job. I wouldn't have this go all the way to the back of the throat. I'd kind of concatenate it so that it was more of a half circle here. That's just moving these points. But for the purpose of this tutorial, what I'd like to do is fill out the face, maybe use a bit of symmetry, and then we can go in and try to fill out the rest of the characters as small sort of props and addendums to their face, such as the hair, ears, things like that. So it kind of looks like this character's going. And when you use mirror, by the way, I don't frankly like it to automatically weld vertices, because you can see here that there's a whole section of vertices that if they welded it together in the lip, it would have sort of merged his lips together, which is not desirable for most characters. So I'm going to be very specific about what I'm grabbing on this character and having it merge together, so that I have a lot of control as to what's actually coming together. So the best view for grabbing these vertices to weld together is perspective wireframe. That way you can be absolutely sure that what you're grabbing in the front is not obscuring something in the back. Even if I merge those mouth bag points, that's actually a bit, that's fine. That is desired. So first things first, let's just kind of increase the threshold, snap those pieces together. We have kind of a whole face now, which is good. So the back of the head, considering that this character is such a cylindrical head, there's a couple of ways we can do this. One of which is that we simply read in a cylinder and make the back of the head and attach it here, making sure we have the same points. Another method is that we could extrude the existing edges here, and it will actually bring those same points to the back of the head. Either is fine. In this case, I'm going to do that. I'm going to extend the polygons to the back of the head. And I'm going to use a little trick doing that, which is that if I click on an edge, hold down my shift key and double click another edge, it's only going to select the edges in between. If I double click an edge that's just one, it'll actually run the length of all the connected and contiguous edges. So that's not really what I'm looking for. The other thing is I can come in and kind of click on symmetry, so that whatever I grab on the character is grabbed on the other side. Again, the mirror is about mirroring it in the X position, which is basically sideways from this view, from the front view. And so if I grab an edge on either side, it's going to grab the corresponding edge in the back. And this allows me the ability to extrude and have dual extrusions simultaneously, which allows me the chance to not just translate outward, but scale in as I move to the back of the head. Another trick I can use is actually scaling this slightly so that it straightens out as it hits the back of the head. So if I just continue to extrude, I can create the necessary links and edges to kind of match this character's shape until we get to the straightaway, which is kind of the back of the head. I have to be careful because I'm doing it in just the side view. I want to create more edges than necessarily it looks like I need here, mainly because I've got a couple of edges here that are bunching up in the back. You can see two of them, but they're kind of on top of each other because from this angle again, you're gonna have this edge of the body, which is the neck, and this edge next to it, and they're kind of bunched up. So the best thing you can do is just keep that in mind as you continue to extrude from the head, so that you can use your scale tool and your translate tool until you have something that approximates that shape, maybe even a little rotation in there. Now I'm going to try to match these edges down here, which are the neck. So really what I can do is grab these edges later, maybe move them forward, grab this edge, move it forward until it aligns here, and make sure that I have two edges in the back of the head here so that I can hit both those points. And I'll probably grab these edges up on the top and move them up. Again, I only want to take care of a couple of things at a time in this operation, so I'm not really too worried about making sure that I nail everything at once. I see a lot of student modelers trying to massage it and make it perfect, and you don't need to worry about everything happening all at once. You just need to make sure that you've got enough information so that you can close off the head. So from here you can actually also work from a different view, say top view, and it might give you a better estimation of closing these two edges. So at this point I think it's probably better if I turn off symmetry. It allows me a little more control, and it'll, I believe, recognize that these are two separate edges if I grab this edge here and I grab this edge here. So if I press scale now, I actually have something between the two. When symmetry is on, it doesn't recognize them as sort of separate edges, and it'll always let you have the control of what seems one edge while manipulating the other one according to the controls of you moving one edge. In this case, however, I actually want the scale to respect the fact that I'm trying to bring them together. I'm just going to continually do so in one axis until it kind of merges them, getting ready for a nice weld, a nice merge. And from here, and by the way, I could have probably done soft select and had a nice effect. I frankly like to do things by hand. It gives me a little more control, but you can play around with things like soft select. In fact, let's just try that to see the effect I can get. If I drag it out to about the middle of the head here, all right. Yeah, it's kind of nice. It's not quite giving me the cylinder I'm looking for. And yeah, I could definitely mess with probably a number of things here. You know, the fall off rate, etc. But this is kind of the reason I like to do things edge by edge, albeit probably more tedium than people expect. But really this is sculpting, and you wouldn't expect any shortcuts messing with things like clay, cutting rock, and this is similar. So if you get into that Zen headspace, man, it gets easy. So now we've got something fairly cylindrical, and I could also be creating for my selections in case I dance across these edges constantly, and I know that I've got my work cut out for me moving back and forth amongst these edges. Remember, you can use selection sets. So let's just say, for sake of an argument, I'm probably going to be going between these sets quite a lot. And what I can do is make a set so that every successive selection of those two edges is going to be easier. That is accomplished by coming up here to the outliner, creating sets, quick select set, and we'll just say edge, head 2. And then in the future, if I need to grab this, I can just left click, right select on it, select set members, and it grabs that set for me. So if I have very few operations, I know I'm going to tweak this a little bit, but not a lot, because I've already kind of got a nice cylinder going for this fellow's head. But if I were to go up and down the detailed geometry that would constantly get lost in other selections, creating a selection set's not a bad idea. So with this character's head wrapped, you can grab the vertices and run your merge. And I think it would be a good idea if, in fact, same vertices, got rid of kind of that sharp point by maybe bringing things in to align with the overall flow from the top, make it a little more cylindrical, a little less harsh. And then we can go into the kind of the massaging of this character's, the top of this character's head. Now I can grab, just double click the ringlet that constitutes the very top of this character's head, because I know I need to grab the entire thing to move it up and start aligning it using scale and translation to the top of the head. And I don't want to be too overly cautious about it. Again, I can grab small points like this little edge here in the back of the head with the hair and just kind of move a singular point. But really, I've kind of accomplished what it is I'm looking for, which is just to create the rest of that head all the way around. In fact, it's arguable that this particular line running down the middle of this character's face is something we don't need. So this edge here is really not contributing much to anything. It doesn't move the geometry, it doesn't change the geometry, it's just kind of a it's an edge in the middle of anything. And the way I get rid of these is I just move them over to an adjoining edge if it exists, and then I can merge the head as a whole, and it should get rid of that particular edge. I should also get rid of little points such as this that I can verify quickly is the only one I've got selected in wireframe. Move it down and snap it so that, again, this sort of grand merge that I will be doing is going to sew these together. Another thing regarding movement, since I want to keep the alignment of this curve here, you see there is the slightest sort of bend to it, very slight. But if I were to just move this down in Y, it might start cutting into the geometry a bit. So one of the tricks you can use is to move a vertex along the existing edge, and you can accomplish this by grabbing a vertex and going into translation mode and pressing the C key. And when you do that, you actually align it along. There you go. I was waiting for the cursor to turn into that circle. That's the sign that you're, and it corresponds with this icon, that you're going to move it along an existing line. And it's awfully tricky, I'll be honest, that even though you can increase and decrease by pressing the minus and the plus key, the size of your controller, it doesn't actually change this tiny little circular yellow orbit that you've got around the cursor, which basically means if you grab that along with the edge that you're looking to move, sort of simultaneously, it'll move along that edge. Now, considering I've got the convergence of 3 points here in a fairly tight space, I got to try and be very careful about it. It seems like I was successful in this case. So while I'm holding down the C key, I'm simply traveling up and down that existing edge, which is good because it lets me sort of straighten out this fellow's chin without being too barbaric. So it's also arguable, this is sort of another way of doing the same thing. If I just grab all of these and scale them at once and move them down, I'm moving the entire edge, and it may not look as destructive because I'm not moving just one point. Again, same trick that I showed earlier. You know, when I grabbed one edge, I came to another edge and double clicked it, holding down the shift key. I'm doing the same here with vertices, and it grabs all of them, and I'm able to sort of align them and move them down. People don't use scaling as much as maybe they should in modeling because it really does kind of help the character, flesh the character out. And I'm kind of noodling here as I do to try and straighten things out and align them while giving you the advice not to do that. So we have our character now. I think it's a good idea maybe to do a grand merge. Just make sure that everything is copacetic. It looks pretty good. It didn't merge. This was the area I was worried about. And I probably have to do the same thing with this edge. Just kind of move it over to another existing part of the chin. So I'll do that really quickly. And then I have to be careful about merging from here on out because I got spaces that are very close together. But you can get past that by going into vertex mode. And just specifically catching the ones that are a little problematic. There we go. Grabbing those two, doing the same thing by coming up to merge and increasing the distance threshold. I'm holding down my left key as I travel my cursor along the word. You notice it turns the cursor into horizontal arrows, which allow me to left click, hold down my mouse key, and then move to the right, and it increases the threshold and snaps those two vertices together, which is what I was looking for. Cool. And there's obviously little spidery ones here that I need to take care of. And you can see that it just kind of snaps them together, which is nice. There we are. All right, looks like we've got a slightly more consistent character. And it's fairly cylindrical. I can continue noodling with these edges, trying to smooth them out over time. But really the point of this exercise is to try and complete the top of the head and get into moving things around to look like his hair. This particular stylized Steven Silver cowlick that's coming up on the top of the head. So let's take a minute and save our scenes and come back and we'll start messing around with the top of the head. Okay, and I've saved. So how do we get the top of this particular head together? Well, it is a unique head. It's basically very squared off like a top of a coffee can, which is okay for this character. Yours may be a little more rounded. But what you can do is you can create a polygon mesh at the top here many different ways. One of the ways you can do is, of course, just sort of double-clicking the edge ring for this person's head and coming up and using the often ignored fill hole, and it will simply put a big polygon in there, which is, of course, completely illegal because it's an n-gon plus. Goes on for many, many different edges here. But from here, for those of you that like to, as I do, just focus on doing things by hand, let's say that the top of this character's head is pointed. Well, if you create sort of if you create a polygon top of the head with a point that you can extrude upward, you've got, your little Cupid doll hair. So this is a way that I can come in and then using the multi-cut tool create, say, a grid across each of these edges, and I can create a matrix. And then I have enough points that I can manipulate and move them around and create something that's a little more organic and a little less stylized, like this perfectly flat top of the head. And it still allows you that degree of control. People that come up here and just use sort of the fast way through, which is to come up and go to triangulate and then quadrangulate, you're asking the computer to make a choice for you. So you may not get, this is okay for my purposes because this never moves. The top of this head is just always going to be flat. Now I need a couple of points here for the cowlick, but I can create those by maybe knocking out these faces and redrawing the fill hole. But for people that want that point at the top of the head, you can go back and grab this edge and actually do an extrusion And that's going to give you a slightly different look. So let me go back and show you what that looks like. So I've got this edge selected here, and if I from here just go to extrusion and make sure that I snap into the scale, I have all these points coming into the center. Now this is probably more polygons. Well, this is definitely more polygons because none of them are connecting to each other. They're all kind of their own new triangle. So this is more points than you would get if you used my previous operation, but it's really not about this being a technical exercise of what do I do and what is best, because those questions are always answered by what is the purpose of this character? Is this serving the point of the game? Do we ever get close enough to see this character's hair in any detail? Well, then, or does this character's hair move? Then you need to create a better solution in modeling. So again, the sort of Cupid doll hairstyle, you could have this come up in what looks like the top of the most dangerous ice cream cone. Not a good look, I'd say, but again, it can serve the purpose of whatever you need. You could smooth these things out. You could create cuts here along this axis with your multi-cut tool, and gradually round out the top of this character's head. So that's useful as well. But again, for my purposes, for this particular character, all I need is kind of the fill hole and grab that face. We can go in and do the triangulate, quadrangulate again. And this is sufficient for my character. This will work for now. And this is going to be a problem area just for hair, because I need to locate, first of all, where those points in space are, and secondly, how am I going to resolve them between these two views in a way that hits both shapes. I need to make sure I have enough geometry up here to do that, and I'm not sure I can do that with these particular faces. So what I'd like to do is delete those, all these faces, including perhaps this one. And I'm going to try to do this kind of on my own, which is I'm going to grab these edges and extrude them, and I'm creating kind of my own gangplank here across the head. And you can say, well, the previous operation sort of did that for you, didn't it? Kind of. It threw some triangles in there, and I could have just cleaned up what I had. I prefer just to come in and do it by hand for the clarity that I have perfect agency over what it is I'm building, and I'm never discovering what sort of dysfunction an automated process has done if I just sort of lean on that in Maya. So in this case, again, this is just a very simple way of creating base bridges across polygon gaps. And I like to take these edges, these vertexes, and really push them outside of the vertices that I need, so that there's visual clarity of the points I want and then the points I have to align them to. So in this case, we're ready also for my merge. And now I have this nice little flat playground in which I can start cutting up the points necessary for me to draw that cowlick. So looking from the front, it's actually going to start right on this edge and come up and then sort of flatten out at the other end of this character's kind of the face mask, if you will. And it goes back a bit as well. So really the polygons I want to start this at would be that selected edge right there. So looking at that in perspective, I can now identify I need more geometry here. And how I'm going to do that is I know that there's basically 2 points on this character's head. And you can see that from the front. You know, I need 2 high points of geometry. So like one here and one here. And then they also have, one has to be more prominent and the other one goes back a bit. So I'm just going to say if I'm looking at the character, my right, not the character's right, which would be left, that's not confusing. This side with my cursor will be the one that houses this smaller hair point. So again, there's many different ways of doing this, and the way I like to create different points in the head is come to the geometry previous and start it from an existing corner, which saves you a couple of polys of just running the length of this entire head just to create something that goes skew to all these other lines. So if I were to create the placement of where that hair should be, I'm just creating geometry that allows me to start pulling this out into more detail. And I am making an assumption here that I will need all of these lines. And I may not, but I can always clean up the ones I don't need. Now there are a number of tutorials that I've seen where people will say this is how you do it, and they do a great job. But for the person just learning Maya, they miss out on kind of the noodling that a person does when they're modeling. The kind of, let me tell you about my thought process of how I'm going to go about cutting up this character and why. And it doesn't mean I'm going to nail it on the very first time I try it, but I'll try several different things until I do. Now these give us sort of the areas that I can create that hair peak, but remember it looks like it needs more geometry to define this valley and then another peak and then a valley. So right now I've got two peaks. The problem is it doesn't really help me. So what I need to do is create more geometry within, and the way to do that is creating some other edges from here all the way to say here. Now I am creating more detail than I might need, and I'm just kind of crowding this out a bit, but if I don't wind up using all of these edges, I can always take one of the vertices or several of the vertices and start snapping them. So I'm going to do a real simple test here. I'm kind of tweaking that, so I'm going to have to create another cut there. But I'm just trying to hit these visual points from the front. This is where you have to start making calls where things don't align perfectly. I had a similar situation with the eye. And I don't want to blame the artist. That's probably me misaligning the two drawings. But let's just assume that you're in a scenario where there is an inconsistency in the drawing, and you just have to run with it. So if I were to choose this divot at the top of this person's head, does that align? Yeah, a little bit. From the front. Yeah, a little bit. So, oops. So if I come in and start grabbing edges, oh dear. If I were to grab these points, raise them up, then I've created kind of the surrounding geometry of the hair. And this is just me sketching. This isn't even me respecting kind of the planar need for the geometry to be smoother. I get that. I do have to come in here and massage this later and make sense of it, but this is how I like to model, which is I just want to run around a little bit and kind of sketch and see if I can't get somewhere with a little pushing and pulling of points, and then I can resolve the grand crimes I'm doing against polygons here later on. So, all right, but enough noodling. You can tell I'm futzing around here. So from the front, at least I have something a little more gradual. Yeah, that kind of hits the high points, the basic high points. I could create more geometry in here, but again, we would start creating more detail than necessary, and I'd want to see this in game before I made that call. So take a look from the side, and I've obscured the drawing, so it's time for X-ray. All right, so from the front, that's these peaks are kind of on the same level, and yet from the right they are obviously not. So I have to make a certain call here, and I have to decide also whether this little cut, more geometry in here, is worth it. So I do think it's going to be worth it because it's such a specific shape. So, whoops, turn off X-ray. So I'm going to go back to my multi-cut tool that I used quite a while ago, but Maya stores in its memory the last tool you used. And if you want to go back to it, you can just go, let's say I was in selection mode, grabbing all kinds of things, edges, vertices. If I press Y, it goes back to the previous tool that I had, allowing me to start cutting up this geometry and making it right, because I've really kind of pushed and pulled quite a few points here and messed a number of things up. But I kind of got the shape I wanted, and now I can come in here and legitimize that geometric push and pull. And I know that there's probably some modelers out there kind of cringing at what I'm doing, but this is a process that allows me to, again, kind of sketch first and then create the geometry that I need to legitimize my noodling. Now this particular peak doesn't make sense if I don't have an adjacent peak to smooth it all over. So I wonder if that's going to help. So my point with this modeling, or this kind of noodling, is it is sculpture, it is sketching, and I don't recommend too much the operation of just pushing and pulling points wildly and then hoping later to fix it. But in this particular case, we had such a specificity of detail in particular areas that just didn't have the need in other areas that I thought, hey, let's have a go at this. This is me triangulating some of the planes that I've really messed up, and just create the geometry you need. Okay, so let's do this. I know that I talked about pulling. You see that drawing in the background is actually curved, and this is rather a straightaway. So I think that I can give it, I'm going to create one cross cut here, and then grab that point, and now I have the geometry sufficient to, from the right view, just push it in a bit. Don't try to crowd it out. And maybe that'll be enough. Oh, well, there's some other areas here that I need to create the geometry. Whoops, that was interesting. Went through one of the image guides. So I've got this point here. What I can do is create numerous edges like so. Probably better done from the top. And it gives this hair a little more, as I keep saying, architectural stability. And sometimes it's these very stylized drawings that are the hardest to try and figure out. Now, I'm not a huge fan of several points, several edges coming into one point, so I'm thinking of taking this edge and deleting it and instead creating an edge from here to here. I think I'll do that. Because again, now this is something I also see people do. They're constantly just grabbing edges and then pressing delete. And while Maya actually does let you do that, in other words, it visually says, yeah, you deleted something, it's incorrect, because what's happened is it's actually left the vertex there, which means these are still separate edges, which means this is a five-sided n-gon. It is certainly not, I'm sorry, it's a quad. But it's certainly not a triangle. So the way to do that, you can fix it afterward, of course, by just grabbing this vertex and snapping it to a nearby vertex. But the way you want to do this from the beginning is you want to grab the edge, and if you want to delete it, you got to go up here and make sure that you click on delete edges. And the reason I keep noodling through this is I'm still dancing between different versions of Maya. So you can go here, delete edge vertex. So excuse my sort of fumbling around to find it here on this version of Maya. So there we are with the merge. It's merged the points that were problem points. And I can do a quick selection of vertices and make sure that these all are actual corners of edges, of existing edges. All right, cool. It has the highest contrast doing that. So I've created enough geometry that if this, yeah, I want to take some of these points and kind of smooth them, not smooth them, you don't smooth points in space. I'm going to move them up so that you can see a more a more gradual curve into the cowlick, like so. Because that's how it's reflected in the drawing. It seems to be a nice curved line. Steven Silver has such great contrast. There's always a straight edge and then a curved edge. And you can see that on the drawings of the arms. Straight and then curved on the opposite side. Same thing with the calf and the instep here, body. And it creates some really great contrast for characters. But sometimes it doesn't have the obvious mass of something realistic. So you have to make calls. And I've really warped this something terrible. So I want to come up, and since I've lost the multi-cut tool in Maya's mind, I want to come up and evoke it again. And I'm going to create an edge from here to here. And maybe from here, whoops, maybe from here to here, because I have that edge flow now, even if it is hair. And there's some very hard edges here, but that works in our favor. So this edge, this poly line, this poly line here is kind of where I'm choosing to come in and harden the edge so that it's easier for the rest of this to be smoothed out using soft norm, using more of a smoothed over look with the normals. And this particular exercise was not to create perfect hair, because I can still see that there's some areas I need a little more control in. A couple more cuts to ease things. But it was a way to sketch and then sort of legitimize the geometry. And it was an extension of a very stylized, whoops, a very stylized drawing. It's the president. He needs us. Let's see. I'm going to create this hard edge here as well, because that's kind of the equivalent of a drawing, is these definite lines. So there's the character's hair from the front and side. Let's see how it lines up. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll be close enough for us to align. And I can again move these points down further, and I can move this point a little higher if need be to create more contrast. But ultimately, as a modeler, you need to make calls on what proximity to the drawing you can attain. Again, this hair and the head as a whole, really. This entire section of the head's actually lower than the other side, which might work. I could just pull those points down. It doesn't look like it tracks here, and I wonder what it's going to do to the character as a whole, if it's going to just look like half their head is dented in. So you may want to get sort of to understand that you can match 90% of what the drawing does, but the more stylized it is, the more calls you're going to have to make on how to interpret this as an actual 3D object. But I think we've got a nice little cowlick going on there, and the geometry is fairly simple. There's no hopefully n-gons, and the bunching up of geometry happens only where there's enough polygons to allow for this particular and centralized distortion to the mesh. Anyway, there we are for the hair. Oh, again with the president.